This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
I'm joined by the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Tell us about where you were on 9/11 and what your first thoughts were, your first reaction when you realized what was going on.
Well, I was at the State Department and getting ready to fly that evening to Moscow to negotiate with the Russians to get us out of the ABM treaty so we could build a national missile defense system. And obviously with the attacks, that stopped that right there. But I remember from my office on the 7th floor of the Pentagon, of the State Department, I could see the Pentagon in flames and smoke from the attack there. And it's an image that I will never forget, as I think all of us will never forget the people killed that day. But I was there at the State Department till well into the night, well into the early morning, waiting for Secretary Powell to come back from Peru. There was no doubt in our minds that we had been attacked, and there was no doubt in our minds that we had to do everything possible to make sure that that never happened again. And you know, even though it's almost 10 years now, that feeling has never lessened in me, and I know in many others. But I do worry that across the country, people have quite naturally turned their attention to other things, and in Washington especially, people have lost the feeling that we had that day, and I think that just increases our vulnerability to another attack.
At the Pentagon, we used to talk about life before and life after 9/11. When you got up in the morning before 9/11, what were your main priorities? What were you really focused on?
Well, as the trip to Russia indicated, it was critical that we get out of the ABM treaty so we could build missile defense capabilities. But right along with that, in our discussions with Russia and others, we were worried about the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological. And everything we had been worried about before 9/11 just grew geometrically after the attack, because as tragic and as devastating as 9/11 was, you only had to think for a second about how bad it would have been if the terrorists had nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons. So the need to stop the proliferation of those kinds of weapons, to keep them out of the hands of rogue states, to keep them out of the hands of terrorists, really rose right to the top of the priority list.
Yeah, it was almost an evolution of the focus and the concerns you had prior to. It just took it to the nth degree, as I used to say to people.
Well, there's no doubt about the vulnerability of the United States and many of our friends and allies to these kinds of suicide attacks. If somebody's prepared to die in the attack, there's no way you can deter a person like that. They've passed beyond a certain point of reason. So what we had to do, in addition to going after the terrorists themselves, was make sure that neither they nor any of their friends ever laid their hands on these terribly destructive weapons, so that even if we couldn't eradicate terrorism as such, we could make sure that the damage that they did would not rise to the level of horror that a nuclear attack would bring.
So how do you think we're doing? 10 years is a long time. And how do you think we're doing militarily, just across the board? How do you think we're doing in the war on terror?
Well, I think it's mixed. I think we've had some major successes. I do think that the overthrow of the Taliban in Afghanistan right after 9/11 was incredibly significant. I think the pursuit of al-Qaeda around the world has resulted in the organization that existed then being dramatically degraded. But the problem, of course, is that the threat has metastasized, so that even with the death of Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda is now a networked organization. There's an al-Qaeda in Iraq, an al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in North Africa, and there are other terrorist groups as well. And I have to say, on that issue of proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, there I don't think we've made as much progress as we needed to. North Korea has exploded 2 nuclear devices since 9/11. Iran is very, very close to having that capability. Other countries, Venezuela, Burma, maybe others, are pursuing them. And some of our old adversaries that we thought were moving in a friendlier direction, Russia in particular, have moved back toward becoming adversaries. So, the world is a complex place, and therefore, while I do think we're safer in many respects because of the policies that we've pursued, the dangers are just not one-dimensional. They're multidimensional, and we need to be concerned about them all the time. So I continue to be very worried, and that's why, as you look back after 10 years on 9/11 and not have another dramatic attack like 9/11. There have been, like the Fort Hood shootings and many attempted attacks. Just because we've escaped another 9/11 for the last 10 years doesn't mean it's inevitable we're going to escape it in the next 10 years.
Right. What might you do differently? If you look back at the policies and the tactics we've pursued over these years, would you do anything differently?
Well, I do a lot of things differently at the national policy level. In my own case, although I thought I worked pretty hard on things like the North Korean and Iranian nuclear weapons program, it's pretty clear we didn't work hard enough, and that the message of the risk that these programs pose didn't spur us into the kind of action that we needed. So I think there's a lot of work. I think this is a vindication of that old saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And it's an old saying, but it's just as true today.
Yeah, it holds up pretty well. Okay, so take us to today and looking forward. And step back a little bit and tell us, where do you think we are now? Where is the United States now in the world? What is our role in the world? How are we perceived? And where do you see things going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think we've been shaken, obviously, by the economic crisis that began back in 2008. I don't think we've recovered as fast as we thought we would, in part because of the policies we've pursued in response to the economic difficulty. But my sense is that Americans understand that we hold our fate in our hands. This is not a case where America has gone into inevitable decline. It's not a case where we're stuck in a new paradigm where American exceptionalism has failed. We've made some mistakes. They are all correctable. And I think back again and again to how America felt in the 1970s. President Carter was telling us we had a national malaise. Our diplomats were being held hostage in Tehran for well over a year. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Everything seemed to be gone in the wrong direction. Then Ronald Reagan was elected president, and within 10 years, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Cold War had been won, and everything had turned around. So the ability of the American people to lift themselves up off the ground and take charge again has been remarkable throughout history. I don't think that has changed either, but we need some leadership that can do that. And that's why I think the 2012 election is going to be so important on so many different issues.
So I just can't help myself. I'm with you about Ronald Reagan. It was an extraordinary time, and he was the right guy in the right place. I always thought he was an eternal optimist, but also quite the realist. But his leadership was extraordinary. When you look ahead the next 18 months, do you see another Ronald Reagan out there?
Well, not yet, but even back then in the late 70s, a lot of people were worried about whether we would find that Ronald Reagan. We had the inspiration of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain,
right?
And I think that sometimes leadership comes from places you don't expect it. So my optimism is an optimism not in any one particular individual, but in America as a whole.
Right. Okay, Ambassador, I know we have got to let you go in a minute or two, but is there anything else on this anniversary, is there anything else you'd like to reflect on, or any point you'd like to make?
Well, just that I think we should all be incredibly grateful for the young men and women of our armed services and of our other services, clandestine and otherwise, who serve overseas to protect us against these threats. Again, we tend to take a lot of this for granted. They never do, because their lives are at risk every single day. But as the saying goes, the land of the free and the home of the brave, we are free because of the brave, and we especially need to be grateful to them today.
This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Museum, where history lives.